It was a busy Monday morning at the Jefferson County Courthouse. Judge William Harrison sat in his large leather chair, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he looked down at the stack of cases before him. The wooden courtroom felt cold and imposing, just the way he liked it. After 20 years on the bench, he had developed a routine that rarely changed. "Next case," his clerk called out, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Dr. Michelle Thompson walked into the courtroom with confident steps. She wore a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, and her natural hair was styled neatly. In her hand, she carried a folder containing documentation about the road construction that had led to her alleged traffic violation. As a respected child psychiatrist, she was used to presenting evidence and explaining complex situations, but today she would find that expertise meant little in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The judge barely glanced up as she approached the podium. His eyes skimmed over her case file. Failure to stop at a temporary traffic signal. 7:45 a.m., construction zone. He had seen hundreds of these cases, and in his mind, this was just another person trying to avoid responsibility for their actions. "Your Honor," Michelle began, her voice clear and professional, "I would like to explain the circumstances of that morning. The construction." "Ms. Thompson," Judge Harrison interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. with a slight edge in his voice, completely ignoring the doctor title listed in her file. "The officer's report clearly states you drove through a temporary stop signal in a construction zone. Do you deny this basic fact?" Michelle took a deep breath. "Your Honor, if I may explain, the temporary signal was obscured by—" "A simple yes or no will suffice." Judge Harrison cut her off again, his tone growing more impatient. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression appear even sterner. In the gallery, a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's treatment of Dr. Thompson was noticeably different from his interaction with the previous case, where he had allowed a young white male to fully explain his situation regarding a similar violation. "No, Your Honor, I don't deny the charge, but there were extenuating circumstances that morning." Michelle tried one more time, maintaining her composure despite the growing frustration she felt. Judge Harrison's hand raised slightly, silencing her again. The morning light glinted off his wedding ring as he reached for his gavel. "Miss Thompson, construction zones are put in place for public safety. Your disregard for these measures puts workers' lives at risk. I'm fining you $500 plus court costs." Michelle's eyes widened slightly at the harsh penalty. The standard fine for such violations was usually much lower. "Your Honor, that seems excessive compared to— Would you like to make it $750? Judge Harrison asked sharply, his pale blue eyes finally meeting hers with a cold stare. This court takes public safety very seriously. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. Several observers exchanged knowing looks, having witnessed similar scenes play out before. The court reporter's fingers paused briefly over her keyboard before resuming their steady rhythm. "No, Your Honor," Michelle replied quietly, her dignity intact despite the unfair treatment. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her checkbook, the movement deliberate and controlled. The folder containing her evidence remained unopened on the podium. As she wrote the check, Judge Harrison was already looking at the next case file, dismissing her presence entirely. "Next case," he called out, not bothering to watch as Michelle gathered her belongings. Walking out of the courtroom, Michelle's heels clicked against the polished floor, each step measured and purposeful. She passed by a courthouse janitor who gave her a sympathetic look. He had seen this scene play out many times before in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Outside, the autumn sun was bright, making the courthouse's white columns gleam. Michelle stopped at the top of the steps, taking a moment to collect herself. She pulled out her phone and quickly rescheduled her morning appointments. The children at her advocacy center would have to wait a little longer today, but she was used to overcoming obstacles. Little did Judge Harrison know that their paths would cross again, in circumstances that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the people he judged so quickly. In his chambers later that morning, Judge Harrison added Dr. Thompson's case file to his completed stack, never once opening the folder to read her prepared explanation or checking her credentials. The sunlight that filled his office highlighted the many awards and certificates on his walls. recognition for years of service that had. The grand ballroom of the City Plaza Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the flash of camera lights. Judge William Harrison adjusted his bow tie as he made his way through the crowd at the annual Children's Future Foundation Gala. His wife, Patricia, walked beside him in an expensive silver evening gown, smiling and greeting their usual circle of friends. "William, dear, we're at table 1 tonight," Patricia reminded him, gently steering him toward the front of the room. "The Chief Justice specifically requested your presence near the podium." Judge Harrison nodded, pleased with the recognition. These charity events were usually tedious affairs to him, but being seated at the prime table made it more bearable. He settled into his chair, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The event coordinator stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're honored to begin tonight's program celebrating those who have dedicated their lives to protecting our city's most vulnerable children." Harrison half listened as various speakers presented statistics about youth programs and foster care initiatives. He checked his watch discreetly, wondering how much longer until dinner would be served. "And now," the coordinator's voice brightened with genuine enthusiasm, "it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. This remarkable woman has transformed the lives of countless at-risk youth in our community. She has established 5 advocacy centers across the state, pioneered innovative trauma therapy programs, and recently received the National Medal of Service for her work in juvenile justice reform." Judge Harrison reached for his water glass, still distracted by his own thoughts. "Please welcome Dr. Michelle Thompson, founder and director of the Children's Voice Alliance." The sound of his water glass hitting the table echoed in his ears as he watched the woman he had found just hours ago walk confidently to the podium. She wore an elegant deep purple evening gown now, but he recognized her immediately. The same composed expression, the same dignified bearing, but now the room was rising in a standing ovation for her. "Thank you," Dr. Thompson began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Every child deserves an advocate, someone who will listen to their story without judgment, someone who will give them a chance to explain their circumstances." Judge Harrison felt his collar grow tight as he remembered how he had refused to let her explain her circumstances that very morning. He watched, frozen in his chair, as she shared moving stories about children she had helped through her centers. "Last month, we helped young Marcus find his voice," she continued, showing slides of a smiling African-American boy. "He had been labeled a troublemaker by his school, written off by the system. But when we looked deeper, we discovered he was acting out because of undiagnosed dyslexia and trauma from losing his father. Today, with proper support and understanding, Marcus is thriving in his new advanced learning program." The audience wiped tears from their eyes as she shared more success stories. Judge Harrison's hands grew cold and clammy as he recognized how many times he had rushed to judgment in his own courtroom, never looking deeper, never allowing full explanations. After her speech, Dr. Thompson was surrounded by admirers and supporters. The governor himself waited in line to speak with her. Judge Harrison watched as she graciously accepted a check for $1 million to expand her advocacy centers. "Wasn't she wonderful?" Patricia whispered to her husband. "Did you know she also volunteers as an expert witness in child custody cases? The Chief Justice says she's transformed how family court handles trauma cases." Judge Harrison couldn't find his voice to respond. He watched as Dr. Thompson posed for photos with the mayor, her smile genuine and warm as she discussed plans for a new youth center in the city's poorest district. Later that evening, as servers cleared dessert plates, Judge Harrison overheard snippets of conversation about Dr. Thompson's latest achievements: a PhD from Harvard, 3 published books on juvenile justice reform, and a pending appointment to the State Children's Rights Commission. The same woman he had dismissed so easily that morning was, in fact, one of the most respected experts in her field. The same woman whose credentials he hadn't bothered to read was transforming the very system he worked in. As he and Patricia drove home that night, the city lights blurred through his windshield. The Chief Justice's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "Dr. Thompson's methods should be required study for every judge in our district. She sees the person behind each case, the story behind each incident." Judge Harrison gripped the steering wheel tighter, knowing that sleep would not come easily tonight. In his mind, he kept seeing Dr. Thompson at his podium, dignity intact, despite his dismissal, and then Dr. Thompson at the gala podium, commanding the respect of the entire room. 2 podiums, same woman, but only one person had bothered to look past their first assumptions. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his chambers the next morning, his coffee growing cold on his desk. The usual stack of case files lay untouched before him. Instead, he was watching video recordings of his own court sessions from the past month, his stomach tightening with each passing minute. "Send in my first case," he heard his recorded voice say in one video. The defendant was a young white businessman charged with reckless driving. "Now, son, tell me what happened that day." His tone was almost fatherly, patient. He switched to another recording. Next case. This time, it was an elderly Hispanic woman with a parking violation. He had barely looked up from his papers, cutting her off mid-sentence when she tried to explain in broken English. Taking off his glasses, Judge Harrison rubbed his tired eyes. He hadn't slept well after the gala, Dr. Thompson's accomplishments weighing heavily on his mind. Now, watching his own behavior play back to him, he could no longer hide from what he saw. "Judge," his clerk, Sarah, knocked softly on the door. "Your first case is ready." "Cancel my morning schedule," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I need to review some cases." Sarah hesitated at the door. In 15 years, she had never heard him cancel court sessions. "Sir? Are you feeling all right?" "No, Sarah, I'm not." He looked up at her, really seeing her concerned expression for the first time. How many other things had he failed to notice over the years? "Could you pull the statistics on my sentencing from the past year? Break them down by race, gender, and age." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Right away, sir." As she left, Judge Harrison opened his laptop and typed Dr. Michelle Thompson Children's Advocacy into the search bar. Articles filled his screen. Revolutionary approach to juvenile justice. Dr. Thompson's method reduces youth reoffending by 60%. Local hero changes lives one child at a time. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the Chief Justice. "Bill, enjoy Dr. Thompson's speech last night. Her new youth center proposal needs a judicial sponsor. Thought of you." He set the phone down without answering. The irony was almost too much to bear. By afternoon, Sarah returned with a thick folder of statistics. Judge Harrison spent hours studying the numbers, each page revealing patterns he had never wanted to see. His fines for minority defendants were consistently higher. His interruptions of their explanations were more frequent. His benefit of the doubt was rarely extended to anyone who didn't look like him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, he pulled out Dr. Thompson's case file from the previous day. This time, he read every page. The construction zone she had driven through had missing signage that morning. 3 other drivers had reported the same issue. She had brought photos and witness statements, evidence he had refused to even look at. Judge Harrison opened his drawer and took out a small notebook his grandfather, also a judge, had given him when he first took the bench. On the first page was written, "Justice is blind, but the judge must see clearly." With a heavy hand, he began to write. Changes needed immediately. 1. Let every person tell their full story. 2. Read all evidence before making decisions. 3. Check my assumptions at the door. 4. Track my interruptions. 5. Review my fines for fairness. A knock on his door made him look up. The cleaning lady, Mrs. Washington, stood in the doorway with her cart. Usually, he would barely acknowledge her presence. Tonight, he noticed her worn shoes, the slight limp in her walk. "Mrs. Washington," he said, surprising her by using her name for the first time in years. "How long have you worked in this courthouse?" 23 years, Your Honor," she replied cautiously. "And in all that time, has anyone ever asked you what changes you think this court needs?" She stared at him, then slowly smiled. "No, Your Honor. No one ever has." "Would you have a few minutes to share your thoughts?" As Mrs. Washington pulled up a chair, Judge Harrison added another line to his notebook. 6. Listen to voices I've been ignoring. The sun had fully set by the time he left his chambers that night. Tomorrow would be different, he promised himself. Tomorrow, he would begin the hard work of not just appearing to be fair, but actually being fair. Dr. Thompson had shown him what real advocacy looked like. Now it was his turn to advocate for change, starting with himself. The initiative. Dr. Michelle Thompson stood at the window of her newest advocacy center, watching children play in the courtyard below. The autumn leaves danced around the playground equipment she had fought so hard to include in the building plans. A young girl with braids was helping a smaller boy climb the slide, showing the kind of natural leadership that Dr. Thompson loved to nurture. Dr. T, her assistant, James, hurried into the office. The state Supreme Court just called. They want to implement your juvenile justice program statewide. Michelle turned from the window, her face lighting up with carefully controlled hope. She had learned over the years not to celebrate too quickly. What exactly did they say, James? They want to use your center as a model for all juvenile cases in the state. They're calling it the Thompson Method. But that's not all. James couldn't contain his excitement. They want to start with a pilot program in Jefferson County. Michelle's smile faltered slightly. Jefferson County, Judge Harrison's jurisdiction. The memory of her courtroom experience was still fresh, but she pushed personal feelings aside. This was about the children, not her. Later that afternoon, Michelle walked through the center's busy halls. In one room, a teenage boy was working with a trauma counselor, using art therapy to express his feelings. In another, a group of young girls attended a leadership workshop. Each room represented years of research, countless grant applications, and endless meetings with skeptical officials. She stopped at the front desk where Mrs. Jones, a grandmother who volunteered 3 days a week, was helping a nervous mother fill out paperwork. "Remember, honey," Mrs. Jones was saying, "this center is different. They actually listen here." Michelle's phone buzzed with an email from the Supreme Court. They wanted her to present her program to all the county judges next week. As she read the details, a small boy tugged at her sleeve. "Dr. Michelle," he whispered, using her preferred name for the children. "Can I show you my test?" Marcus, the boy she had mentioned in her gala speech, held up a math test with a big red A on top. 6 months ago, he had been labeled a lost cause. Now, with proper support and understanding, he was thriving. "This is wonderful, Marcus." She knelt down to his level, their standard practice for talking with children. "How did you feel when you saw the grade?" "Scared at first," he admitted. "But then I remembered what you taught us about breathing. I took 3 deep breaths, just like this." He demonstrated the calming technique they taught all their children. Michelle's heart swelled with pride. This was why she did this work. This was why she fought through every obstacle, every dismissal, every prejudiced assumption. For moments like these. Back in her office, she reviewed her presentation for the judges. Her phone rang again. This time it was the governor's office. They wanted to feature her program in a national conference on juvenile justice reform. Dr. Thompson, her secretary, called through the intercom. "The architect is here to discuss plans for the new East Side Center." The East Side project was her most ambitious yet, a combination advocacy center and educational facility in the city's poorest neighborhood. The same neighborhood where Judge Harrison had grown up, according to her research. She had learned long ago to know everything about the power players who could affect her work. As she spread the architectural plans across her desk, she heard laughter from the courtyard below. A new child had joined the group, a shy boy who had arrived just yesterday, removed from an abusive home. The girl with braids was showing him how to use the swing set, already taking him under her wing. Michelle made a note to commend the girl's leadership skills later. Their program tracked and encouraged every small sign of progress, every tiny step forward. Change didn't happen overnight, whether in children or in adults. She had learned that lesson well over her 15 years of advocacy work. Her computer pinged with another email, the final details for next week's judicial presentation. Judge Harrison's name was on the attendance list. Michelle took a deep breath, just like she had taught Marcus. Personal feelings aside, this was an opportunity to create real change in the system. "James," she called to her assistant, "let's add the new statistics from Marcus's group to the presentation. The judges need to see concrete proof that given a chance, given a voice, every child can succeed." Outside her window, the autumn wind picked up, scattering more leaves across the courtyard. The children kept playing, kept growing, kept proving that change was possible. And in 1 week, she would have the chance to show that to every judge in the county, including one who needed to learn that lesson most of all. The reconciliation attempt. Judge Harrison stood outside the Children's Voice Alliance building, gathering his courage. The modern glass building reflected the morning sun, making it seem to glow. Through the windows, he could see children and families moving about, their faces showing none of the fear he usually saw in his courtroom. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the elevator button. In his briefcase was a formal letter of apology he had written and rewritten 12 times, along with a check returning Dr. Thompson's fine with interest. It felt like too little, too late, but it was a start. Fourth floor, the receptionist had told him when he called to request this meeting. Now, walking down the bright hallway decorated with children's artwork, he felt more nervous than he had during his first day on the bench. A young boy ran past him, laughing, chased by a therapist calling out, "Walking feet, Tommy, remember our rules." The casual joy in their interaction was so different from the stern atmosphere he maintained in his courtroom. "Judge Harrison," a young man approached him. "I'm James, Dr. Thompson's assistant. She'll see you now." Dr. Thompson's office was warm and welcoming, with comfortable chairs and walls lined with children's drawings and thank-you notes. She stood as he entered, professional as ever in a burgundy blazer. "Judge Harrison," she greeted him, her voice neutral. "Please have a seat." He sat down, noticing a child's craft project on her desk, a paper heart decorated with the words, "Thank you for listening to me." "Dr. Thompson," he began, his rehearsed speech deserting him. I owe you an apology." "Is this about the traffic fine?" she asked, her expression carefully controlled. "Yes, and no." He opened his briefcase with unsteady hands. "The fine was just a symptom of a much bigger problem. I've spent the past week reviewing my court records, and what I've found..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I found patterns of bias that I can no longer ignore." Through her window, they could hear children playing in the courtyard below. A girl's voice floated up. "You can do it, Marcus, just like Dr. Michel taught us." Dr. Thompson's expression softened slightly at the sound. "Why are you here, Judge Harrison?" "I want to learn," he said simply. "I've read about your program, about the changes you've made in juvenile justice. The way you give everyone a voice, a chance to be heard." He placed the envelope with the check on her desk. "I didn't give you that chance in my courtroom." She looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "This isn't about me, Judge Harrison. It's about a system that needs to change." "I know," he nodded. "That's why I'm here. I've requested to be assigned to juvenile court cases. I want to understand your methods, to learn how to really see the people who come before me." A knock at the door interrupted them. A small boy peeked in, his eyes wide at seeing a stranger in Dr. Thompson's office. "Come in, Marcus." Dr. Thompson smiled warmly. Judge Harrison was just leaving. The judge stood up, recognizing the boy from the gala presentation slides. Marcus clutched a paper in his hand. "Another test, probably." "Actually," Dr. Thompson said, studying the judge's face, "why don't you stay? Watch how we work with our children. See what happens when we take the time to listen." For the next hour, Judge Harrison sat quietly in the corner of Dr. Thompson's office. He watched as she reviewed Marcus's test with him, celebrating his successes and calmly working through his mistakes. He observed her session with a teenage girl struggling with anger issues, noting how Dr. Thompson never once raised her voice or showed impatience. As the afternoon went on, Dr. Thompson began explaining her methods. "We create a safe space first," she told him. "No one opens up when they feel judged or rushed." Judge Harrison took notes, filling page after page. When a mother broke down crying while describing her child's struggles, he reached for his handkerchief before Dr. Thompson could offer tissues. She noticed. "Come back tomorrow," she said as he prepared to leave. "There's a lot more to learn." Walking to his car that evening, Judge Harrison heard Marcus's voice again. "Bye, Judge Harrison. Are you coming to help kids too?" He turned back, seeing the boy waving from a window. Dr. Thompson stood behind him, her expression thoughtful but no longer cold. "Yes," he called back, realizing he meant it with all his heart. "I'm going to try." The collaboration. 3 months had passed since Judge Harrison's first visit to the Children's Voice Alliance. The morning sun streamed through his courthouse windows, warming the new arrangement of his chambers. Gone was the imposing desk that had created a barrier between him and visitors. Instead, comfortable chairs formed a circle, making the space more welcoming. "Your 9 o'clock is here, Judge," his clerk Sarah announced. showing in a teenage boy and his mother. The boy's shoulders were hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor, a posture Judge Harrison recognized from his own observations at Dr. Thompson's center. "Thank you for coming," he said, using the gentle tone he had learned from watching Dr. Thompson. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable." The boy looked up, surprised by the informal setting. His mother's tense expression eased slightly as they chose chairs near the window. "Before we discuss your case," the judge continued, "I'd like to hear your story. Not just what happened last week, but what brought you here." As the boy began to talk, Dr. Thompson watched silently from the corner. She had been coming to the courthouse twice a week, helping Judge Harrison implement her methods in the juvenile justice system. Today was his first solo session. The boy's story unfolded slowly. His father had left last year. His grades had dropped. He had started hanging out with a new group of friends. The shoplifting incident was his first offense. "What do you think should happen now?" Judge Harrison asked, another technique he had learned from Dr. Thompson. The boy looked startled. No one had asked for his opinion before. I want to make it right," he said quietly. "The store owner, I want to apologize to him." Judge Harrison nodded, making notes. In the past, you would have simply issued a fine and moved on. Now, he saw an opportunity for real change. Later that afternoon, Dr. Thompson and Judge Harrison sat in the courthouse cafeteria, reviewing the morning's cases. The lunch crowd bustled around them, some people doing double takes at seeing the unlikely pair working together. "You're getting better at asking open-ended questions," Dr. Thompson noted, stirring her coffee. "The way you handled the Morrison boys' case showed real progress." "I keep thinking about how many kids I failed before," Harrison admitted. "How many stories I never heard." "We can't change the past," she replied, a phrase she often used with her young clients. "But we're changing the future." Their collaboration had already produced remarkable results. Juvenile repeat offender rates in Jefferson County had dropped by 15%. Other judges were starting to take notice, requesting to observe their sessions. "The Chief Justice called this morning," Harrison shared. "He wants us to present our program at the National Judicial Conference next month." Dr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Us?" "Your methods, my implementation in the court system. We make a good team." He paused, then added quietly, "Though I never would have known that if I hadn't treated you so poorly that day in court." "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes," she said, watching a young public defender hurry past their table. "Speaking of which, have you considered my proposal about the mentorship program?" Harrison nodded enthusiastically. "Pairing juvenile offenders with law students? I've already talked to the law school dean. She's on board." They spent the next hour planning the mentorship program, their different perspectives creating a stronger approach than either could have developed alone. Dr. Thompson's understanding of child psychology complemented Harrison's knowledge of the legal system. As they wrapped up their meeting, a court officer approached their table. "Judge Harrison, the Reynolds case is ready." "Would you like to observe?" Harrison asked Dr. Thompson. She smiled, gathering her papers. "Actually, I need to get back to the center. I trust you got this one." Walking through the courthouse corridor, they passed the spot where they had first met, where Harrison had once dismissed her so quickly. Now, judges and lawyers nodded respectfully to them both, recognizing the changes they were creating together. "Remember," Dr. Thompson said as they reached the courthouse steps, "every child's story deserves to be heard." Harrison finished. It had become their shared motto, posted now in every juvenile courtroom in the county. As Dr. Thompson drove back to her center, she thought about how far they had come. The judge who had once silenced her voice was now helping others find theirs. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of understanding. The transformation. 6 months had passed since Judge Harrison and Dr. Thompson began their collaboration. On this crisp morning, the Jefferson County Courthouse felt different. Children's artwork hung on the walls, brightening the old building's stern atmosphere. In the waiting area, a small library of books and quiet activities helped calm nervous families. Judge Harrison stood in his robes, watching people enter his courtroom. His posture was the same, but his eyes were different now, softer, more observant. Sarah, his clerk, was helping a young mother fill out paperwork, explaining each section carefully. "Your Honor," a familiar voice called. "Marcus," Dr. Thompson's former student, now volunteered as a peer mentor for other kids in the juvenile justice program. At 15, he carried himself with quiet confidence. The new mentors are ready for orientation. Harrison nodded, following Marcus to the courthouse's community room. 20 law students sat waiting, eager to begin their training as juvenile case mentors. Among them was Harrison's own daughter, Rachel, who had been inspired by her father's transformation to change her career focus to juvenile law. "Welcome," Harrison began, his voice warm. "6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about justice. I was wrong." He shared the story of his encounter with Dr. Thompson, no longer embarrassed, but using it as a teaching moment. "One traffic court session changed not just my perspective, but our entire county's approach to juvenile justice." The students listened intently as he explained their new mentorship program. Each would be paired with a young person in the system, offering support and guidance through the legal process. It was one of many changes Harrison had implemented after learning from Dr. Thompson. Later that morning, Harrison presided over his first case of the day. A 13-year-old girl sat nervously with her father, accused of stealing from a classmate. "Before we begin," Harrison said gently, "I'd like to hear your story. Not just about what happened, but about what led to this moment." The girl looked up, surprised. Slowly, her story emerged. She had taken her classmate's new phone, but not for herself. Her little sister was being bullied, and she had wanted to delete cruel messages being spread about her. As she spoke, Harrison noticed signs he would have missed 6 months ago: her worn clothes, the way her father's hands shook slightly, the dark circles under her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Your Honor," the girl's father spoke up, his voice tight with worry, "we can't afford to pay a fine. I just lost my job. And—" Harrison raised his hand gently. "Mr. Chen, there are other ways to make this right." He turned to his computer, pulling up a list of community programs Dr. Thompson had helped establish. "What if your daughter could learn about cyberbullying prevention, then teach others? We have a peer education program that might be perfect for her skills." The relief on their faces reminded him of how he used to make snap judgments, issuing fines without considering circumstances or looking for better solutions. During the lunch break, other judges stopped by his chambers, curious about his methods. Judge Martinez, known for being particularly strict, had noticed that Harrison's cases had the lowest repeat offender rate in the county. "It's not my method," Harrison explained, showing them the statistics. "Dr. Thompson taught me that every case is more than just a file. Every person has a story that deserves to be heard." That afternoon, he visited the courthouse's new Youth Resource Center, another initiative inspired by Dr. Thompson's work. Teenagers who had gone through the system now helped newcomers understand their rights and responsibilities. The walls were covered with positive messages and information about community resources. Sarah appeared at his door with the day's final case file. "Judge, you might want to see this one personally. It's similar to Dr. Thompson's traffic case." Harrison picked up the file, reading it carefully, a habit he now practiced with every case. A small note fell out, handwritten by Dr. Thompson. "Remember where this all began. Keep transforming the system, one story at a time." Looking around his transformed courtroom, Harrison smiled. The stern judge who once rushed through cases, seeing only black and white, was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned to listen, to understand, and to seek true justice, not just punishment. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows, Harrison prepared for his final case of the day. On his desk sat a new sign, one that appeared in every juvenile courtroom in Jefferson County. "Every story matters. Every voice counts." The legacy. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic court session. The Grand Conference Hall of the state Supreme Court building was packed with judges, lawyers, and community leaders from across the country. At the podium, Dr. Michelle Thompson and Judge William Harrison stood side by side, preparing to address the National Conference on Judicial Reform. "A year ago," Dr. Thompson began, her voice clear and strong, "a traffic ticket brought two very different worlds together. Today, we're here to show you how that collision changed not just our county's justice system, but our entire approach to community healing." The presentation screen behind them showed dramatic statistics. Juvenile repeat offenses down by 40%, community satisfaction with the courts up by 65%, and a new model of justice that was being studied by law schools nationwide. Judge Harrison stepped forward. "I was that judge who issued that traffic ticket," he admitted to the crowded room. "I was also that judge who thought he knew everything about justice. Dr. Thompson taught me that true justice begins with listening." In the audience, Marcus, now high school junior and president of the Youth Advisory Board, sat with a group of teen mentors. They had all been through the system and emerged stronger, thanks to the programs Harrison and Thompson had created together. The Thompson-Harrison method, as it was now known, had transformed Jefferson County's courthouse into a model of community justice. The building itself told the story. The stark corridors now housed resource centers, meditation rooms, and spaces where families could meet with counselors and mentors. After their presentation, a line of judges and officials formed to speak with them, but Harrison noticed Dr. Thompson's attention was elsewhere, focused on a young mother crying quietly in the corner of the hall. "Go," he said softly, "this is what really matters." While Harrison handled the official questions, Dr. Thompson sat with the young mother, listening to her story about her troubled teenager. Within minutes, she was making calls to connect the family with resources in their hometown. Later that afternoon, they attended the opening ceremony of their newest joint venture, the Thompson-Harrison Center for Community Justice. The modern building stood at the intersection of two neighborhoods, the wealthy district where Harrison had grown up and the struggling area where many of their young clients lived. This center, Dr. Thompson announced to the gathered crowd, represents what happens when we break down barriers, when we stop seeing cases and start seeing people, when we replace judgment with understanding. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was performed not by officials, but by children from their programs. Marcus stood with a young girl who had recently completed their juvenile diversion program. Together, they cut the red ribbon as cameras flashed. Inside the center, every detail reflected their shared vision. The walls displayed artwork created by young people in their programs, alongside their stories of transformation. One floor housed legal aid offices, another contained counseling spaces, and the top floor was dedicated to education and job training. Judge Harrison paused by a large photograph near the entrance. It showed his old courtroom, with its imposing bench and stern atmosphere, next to a picture of his current courtroom, warm, welcoming, and designed for conversation rather than confrontation. "Sometimes," Dr. Thompson said, joining him, "our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest purpose." As the day went down, they sat in the center's rooftop garden, watching the sunset over the city. Below them, families were already using the center's resources. A teenager was getting homework help in the education room. A mother was meeting with a job counselor. A young boy was attending his first anger management session. "Did you ever imagine," Harrison asked, "when I find you that day, that we end up here?" Dr. Thompson smiled. "I imagined that change was possible. I just didn't know it would start with you." Their phones buzzed simultaneously. News from the state Supreme Court. Their program was being implemented across all counties. Starting next month, every judge in the state would be trained in their methods. As they looked out over the city they had helped transform, a group of children played in the center's playground below. Their laughter floated up to the rooftop, the sound of hope, of second chances, of justice reimagined. "Every story matters," Harrison said softly. "Every voice counts," Dr. Thompson finished. And in that moment, watching their vision become reality, they knew that their unlikely partnership had created something that would outlast them both. A legacy of justice tempered with compassion, of authority balanced with understanding, and of the power of seeing beyond first impressions to the truth that lies within every human heart.